is a pretty significant no. And as we were talking before the break, I think we have the oil futures or the gas prices right now and the Dow futures right now. Gas prices are up. It was about 4% when I looked at it earlier, still 4%, a crude oil and Brent crude. Um, the markets are basically saying, yeah, we don't really think that this thing is going to get resolved anytime soon.
No, I do just have to remind you about the polling. And that's something that strikes me is we have seen in the past 4 weeks one of the most significant tactical military achievements since the Gulf War. I mean, just a incredible show of strength and of force. I'm talking about the initial one, the happy one that we like to talk about in 91, right? The shock and awe that brought back the American sense of pride in the wake of Vietnam and the defeat there. The fact that the American people are not supporting it has very little to do with what's happened. It has everything to do with the fact that it is trailing in the polling to Donald Trump's approval. Mark, looking at those oil numbers, and the president said this several times, and it's hard to disaggregate what he's saying that is hyperbolic and what he's saying that is sincere. When he says we expected it to be way worse than this, I entirely believe him. The fact that oil is trading around 100 with the Strait of Hormuz being closed now for 4 weeks is insane. This is so much less dramatic than I think the expectation was. And it reminds me of the concerns about what Hezbollah would do against Israel if there was significant action, the tens of thousands of rockets that would rain down, and Israel was able to neutralize that threat without that doom and gloom. We were talking earlier about the popularity.
The American people, I think they understand, but they don't think that I think they are saying very clearly, they do not think that this step needed to be taken. And that's actually Trump's own fault.
Rating. As is the operation in Venezuela. The operation in Venezuela is 30 points more popular in Venezuela than in the United States.
So wait, so what are you suggesting?
I'm saying that Donald Trump, and he's
you think this is a Trump thing? That's because Trump is so unpopular?
I think that if there was capitulation from day one and Trump was getting a parade down the Grand Boulevard in Tehran, he would still be sitting at the similar approval rating because opinions are
Don't you think Americans are rational about paying $1 more
I've seen very
per
little
gallon
rationality
of gas?
in the
I mean,
public's view of
that
Donald
seems
Trump.
actually quite rational. I don't share your skepticism because he told them a year ago that he had already done the job. He had already neutralized the nuclear program. So then for him to come back and say, well, we need to wage a war, that seems like a bait and switch. I think Americans are rationally saying, what on earth is that about?
Well, over in Europe, you heard Christine Lagarde already say last week, you're going to see the reverberations of this war. Everybody watches that oil number. It's not just that number to watch. I was just after the speech talking to somebody who's very brilliant on financial markets. And they said to me, Rena, you're going to see the shocks continue from fertilizer to Africa to Asia to Europe. And Europe understands that. But they also did hear Trump loud and clear. They've already made moves on defense.
What makes this moment so dangerous is not just that the Strait of Hormuz has been disrupted for weeks or that oil jumped again. It is that the military picture and the political picture are now moving in opposite directions. And that is when governments start making the worst decisions. On one side, there is a real argument that the opening phase showed enormous force, speed, and capability. Even some critics have had to admit that the immediate battlefield result looked far more effective and far less chaotic than many feared. Markets, for all the panic talk, have not yet behaved like they believe the world is ending. Oil rising matters, but the fact that crude is not exploding even more violently tells you something important. Traders still think this can be contained. The problem is that wars do not stay contained just because markets hope they will. And right now, the deeper damage is spreading through alliances, credibility, and public trust faster than it is showing up on a price chart. That is the part people need to focus on. Because a tactical success is not the same thing as a strategic success. In fact, sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes a powerful opening strike creates the illusion of control precisely when the real costs are only beginning to form. That is what this is starting to look like. The visible scene is easy to understand. Ships rerouting, energy traders reacting, governments scrambling, military pressure still hanging over one of the most important waterways on Earth. But the less visible scene may matter even more. European allies are reportedly refusing some of the things Washington clearly expected. Some do not want to send naval forces into Hormuz. Some do not want their territory used to launch more attacks. That is not a small diplomatic inconvenience. That is a warning light. Because when allies begin saying no in the middle of a crisis, they are not just rejecting a request. They are signaling that they do not trust the political judgment behind the operation. And they do not want to inherit the consequences. That changes everything. It means the United States may be able to act militarily, but not automatically lead politically. And if that gap widens, the strength shown on day 30, but not automatically lead poliplatet. Had it not backwardinate ganarami. There is another contradiction here that is impossible to ignore. If the operation was supposed to project deterrence, why is it also producing more allied anxiety, more economic uncertainty, and more pressure on NATO at the same time? That is not deterrence in the clean, stable sense leaders like to describe. That is power being used in a way that may expose hidden fragility. Europe is already moving to build more of its own defense ecosystem. On paper, that can look like a vindication of long-standing American complaints that Europe has on an extended defense. But look one level. That if allies are spending more because they no longer believe they can reliably depend on Washington, that is not alliance renewal. That is alliance erosion wearing the mask of burden sharing. And that is a much more serious development. Because once trust starts breaking inside a military alliance, rebuilding it is slower and harder than launching missiles. The domestic politics are just as revealing. Support at home appears weak, and the reason matters. It is too easy to dismiss public skepticism as simple partisanship or war fatigue. Some of that may be true, but there is also a more rational explanation. If people were told earlier that the main threat had already been neutralized, then asking them now to absorb a larger war, higher fuel prices, and open-ended risk feels less like leadership and more like a bait and switch. Voters can live with sacrifice when they believe the objective is clear, necessary, and honestly explained. What they resist is being told that the crisis is over, then suddenly being told the crisis requires much more blood, money, and escalation. That credibility gap is not just a messaging problem, and escalating. That credit in war, it becomes an operating problem. Because once the public starts doubting the stated purpose, every new cost looks less like defense and more like drift. And those costs are not limited to gasoline. The broader shock runs through fertilizer, shipping, food systems, industrial inputs, import prices, and vulnerable economies far from the battlefield. That matters for Africa, for Asia, for Europe, and eventually for American consumers who think this is still a distant conflict. This is why the oil number is important. It is not the full map of damage. A war can look manageable on the screen, while its secondary effects are quietly destabilizing entire regions. That is how strategic miscalculation often works. Not through one spectacular collapse, but through a chain of pressures that spread faster than leaders admit. And then there is the geopolitical winner lurking in the background. If the Atlantic Alliance is pulled into internal crisis, if Europe and Washington are fighting over obligations, if trust inside NATO they just need the Western coalition to come out of this more divided, more suspicious, and less coherent than it was before. That is a victory of a different kind, but it counts. So yes, there may have been a real display of military power here. Yes, some early fears may have been overstated. Yes, the immediate outcome may look stronger than critics expected. But that is exactly why this moment is so deceptive. A war can begin with precision and still end in strategic self-harm. It can project strength abroad while distant at home. It can avoid the worst-case market panic and still trigger a wider energy, alliance, and credibility crisis. And that is the question now hanging over all of this. Was this the beginning of restored deterrence, or the opening move in a conflict that is already exposing the limits of American leverage? That remains unsettled. What is settled is that the costs are no longer theoretical, the alliance strain is no longer hidden, and the next decision matters far more than the last justification. Let me know where you think this is heading, because the military headlines and the strategic reality are no longer saying the same thing. Watch the next moves from Europe. Watch the pressure inside NATO, and watch whether the public is being prepared for a short campaign or a much longer trap. Subscribe so you do not miss the next shift in this story.